Hello, this is Les Underhill speaking. I'm the Director of the Animal Demography Unit at UCT. This is a presentation that I frequently give at the ADU's Citizen Scientist Days, and the first few slides show the context in which this presentation was first given as the Leventis Lecture at the AP Leventis Ornithological Research Institute at the University of Jos in Nigeria in 2014. Dr. Shiwu Manu is the director of APLORI, and just a few weeks before I gave my lecture, Yari is receiving a major international award for ornithological research from the Duke of Edinburgh. So this was an event that took place in London just a few weeks before I got to Jos. This is the AP Leventis Ornithological Research Institute. It's about 15 kilometers from the center of the city of Jos, and it's in the Plateau state of Nigeria. So this is the building that houses the lecture theatres, the library, the staff offices. In the foreground, you see that building again, and you see it's in its context, in its setting. The little house in the distance is where visiting lecturers and academics stay, and the hillside is the edge of an important bird area, the Amurum Forest, and this is a place that holds two of Nigeria's endemic species, the rock firefinch and the Jos Plateau indigo bird. So when you are on the veranda of the house and you look out up at the hill, there are 200 species which have been recorded from this spot, 200 bird species. Before we went off to give this lecture, I got into my University of Cape Town PhD regalia. A few days before I flew, I asked them what was the dress code, and they told me to wear a tie and a jacket, and they would give me a gown. So I got the message and I went and borrowed a PhD gown from the UCT wardrobe. And soon after this, Manu put on his University of Oxford PhD robe. So it was a very impressive group of people who said the event. Here is the program. Gosh, it starts at 10 o'clock, and finally, 40 minutes later, the AP Leventis lecturer gets his opportunity. So it started off with an academic procession, which just looks like an academic procession at any university across the world. And then after all the formalities, they finally got to introduce the lecturer, and I had to stand next to this professor on the platform, and my heart sank when I realized that he had 3 pages of introduction to. And finally it was my turn, and I talked about how to make a difference to biodiversity conservation. There are lots of dreams of Africa. People have dreams about health in Africa, peace in Africa, water, electricity, prosperity in Africa. But the dream that we're talking about today is the dream for biodiversity. What does it consist of? It's very simple. It consists of generating the baseline distribution maps for biodiversity. Oh, you say, if you buy a field guide, it's got maps in it, surely. But the reality is those maps are mostly figments of people's imagination. They are based on a few specimens dotted around, collected in museums around the world, and somebody has taken those few dots and drawn a blob around it and said, this is the distribution. Scientists also model distributions from those handful of spots where the species has actually occurred. But what is really needed are baseline maps which are actually based on real data. And the only way we're going to make those maps is if we get every single person listening to this talk to help do it. Why do we need these maps? Well, the reason is simple, is that our survival depends on them. Climate change is happening. Development is happening. Biodiversity is shrinking. Biodiversity is in retreat. And our survival depends on the maintenance of our ecosystem services. Somehow, because of where we are placed, straddling the equator, how far south we stretch into the Indian Atlantic Ocean, Africa is the most vulnerable of all continents to climate change. When I first went to JOS 7 years ago, JOS, the AP Leventis Research Institute was out in the country. Now the urban sprawl is starting to overtake it. The pace of development is scary. The IUCN is warning us that climate change is going to impact species. And here they proudly announce that they have the tools that will give us several decades of warning time that species might go extinct because of climate change. And down at the bottom it says, we have some of the tools we're going to need for identifying species vulnerable to climate change. And those tools will work well in Europe and North America because they have good distribution data. The tools. In Africa, we don't have good, reliable distribution maps in order for us to apply these tools and find the species. The African Development Bank Group has this big strategy document for how Africa should be developed over this 10-year period. You search hard in that publication and you ultimately find a concession to biodiversity. It says, development is closely tied to nature and economic growth is not sustainable without preserving the continent's ecosystem services. That's what the rest of that paragraph means. So, development is a waste of time if we don't do it sustainably in a way that preserves the continent's ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are being stressed and stretched by development, and we need to map them. So, the African Development Bank Group says they want to retain our ecosystem services. But how can you know whether you are retaining the ecosystem services if you don't have the baseline maps against which to measure it? And so, our ability to effectively manage and conserve the incredible abundance and diversity of life in Africa is compromised by our limited knowledge of current animal distribution patterns. What can I do to make a difference? And most speakers at this point say, give money to my organization and we will make a difference on your behalf. But I am saying it's in your power to make. You contribute data to the ADUs, projects. That's how you. So you start off being unaware of these projects, then you learn a bit about them, and ultimately you participate. But the biggest gap comes between being interested in the projects and participating. And so I urge all of you, take the leap. Believe in yourself. Contribute your data into these projects. Somehow that act of faith, that act of self-belief is one that is very, very difficult for many. Here's how we make a difference. We have a model for how we make a difference. This is the slope of influence. And as things get higher up the slope, they have more influence on biodiversity and making a difference. So the ADU sits right now on 18 million records of biodiversity distribution. It's not enough, nowhere near enough to do these maps. But as long as the data sits in that database, it has zero influence. It's right at the bottom of the triangle. So what we do in the ADU is convert that database into information. And by information, I mean maps, graphs, tables, and all sorts of summaries of the information. For example, information about the timing of arrival and departure of migrant birds. And we can see how that is changing through time in the face of climate change and development. That's information. It's got some influence, but we need to turn it into narrative.